Hey, this is Ina, in with you in the fight back, and today I want to talk about the tendency of the average rate of profit to decline, something Marx analyzed very much in Das Kapital, something that is very fundamental to understanding the laws and nature of capitalist economy. And to do that, video is going to be rather long. There's going to be some formulas in it, and I hope you'll bear with me, take your time, and I hope I can manage to present this in a rather understandable and as concise as the material allows. Now we know, for example, that surplus value produced by workers in each factory is in a sense locked in commodities. So whether we're producing a t-shirt, a bed, or whatnot, the value is locked in those commodities. So if they're unsold, they're not making any money for the capitalist. But that money is realized or returned to the capitalist as money when it is sold in market conditions at a price that allows for surplus value to be realized. So you sell it, you get the money back, you can use it to improve production or hire more workers, or to buy yourself that new mansion you want. And we can see that all enterprises producing at an average rate of productivity, not those lagging behind or in far ahead, will generally realize the surplus value produced by workers or sell their commodities at a price equal to the value of the product. But things get more complicated when we talk about capitalists who are operating above or below an average level of productivity. What does it mean to have a below average level of productivity? Well, say a firm produces 500,000 t-shirts a year. That sounds pretty good, but let's say the average is actually 3 million t-shirts a year. This firm is in a sense wasting labor time. It's inefficient, it's lagging behind. The surplus value produced won't be realized in its entirety by the capitalist. It will work at a profit below the average rate of profit for all enterprises in a particular country. So we're assuming at this point that the total number of surplus value in society, or profit to be very simplistic, is a fixed mass dependent upon the total labor hours of all workers engaged in production, because it is workers who produce value. Without workers, no value is produced. So firms operating below average rate of profit have wasted labor time. Thus, there is more surplus value available, which is captured by capitalists operating at above average level of productivity. These firms have, in a sense, economized on labor time, so perhaps they have more efficient machines that they may need less workers for. And in a sense, they're rewarded by society for it. Rewarded, of course, like that. How does this operate in society? How does this operate in real life? Well, let's say that the average selling price for a computer is $1,000. So bear with me, this is going to take some time. The average selling price for a computer is $1,000. What will be the difference between a plant operating below average productivity of labor and one operating above it? Well, the first, below productivity, would say spend $900 to produce a computer. $900 to produce a computer below average, and the profit would in a sense be $100. Because in spending on computer, you have to spend on parts and on labor, on keeping your constant capital up to date and whatnot. Now the second, we have an average, above average productivity. And you say, in this example, you're producing a computer at $750, and again, for parts, for machinery, and you realize $250 in profit. And all that being said, let's actually look at how this would appear. Let's actually look at these figures themselves. So having laid out the below and above average rate of profit for computer production, what in this sense could we say actually is the average rate of profit for computer production? We would say, for instance, that it costs $850 to produce a computer. This is wages and material, and the profit realized is $150. So let's look at those figures. So we can see from the rather simple example I gave you that the average rate of profit is not where the capitalist is going to invest. Rather, they're going to want to actually invest in the place that is making more money, that is in the above average rate of profit, as opposed to the average and certainly the below average. Because capitalist competition and capitalist society favors enterprises which are economically ahead, those that make super profits as opposed to average or below profits. So think about it. If you can get in on the ground floor and you're a capitalist, you're an investor, and you can invest in a place that is making substantial profits in a particular branch of industry, you would do that. Why would you do? And you would want to invest in a place that is making $250 per profit on computer as opposed to, say, $100 per profit on computer. That's rather elementary, and from a capitalist rationality, it makes absolute sense. But again, so with average profits rates, with average profits, we have to remember this is kind of an abstract idea. It is an average around which real profit rates of different branches and enterprises kind of fluctuate. So capital flows toward branches where there are super profits and away from branches where profits are below average. I think this makes sense, and I think we can move on. So as capital ebbs and flows from one branch to another, again, depending on the average rate of profit, which does fluctuate, the rates of profits tend to approximate the average without ever reaching it in some kind of absolute way, because the system is constantly changing, it's constantly fluctuating. And now this is the way in which the equalization of the rates of profit is affected. So how do we determine the abstract average of profit? Well, we take the total mass of surplus value produced by all workers in a given number of years and in a given country, and draw its ratio to the total mass of capital investment in that country. And this will be explained, so bear with it. And so what is the formula for the rate of profit? The ratio between surplus, well, it is actually the ratio between surplus value and total capital. And you can see this in the formula provided just ahead. So I want you to bear in mind the formula for the rate of profit, because it's going to keep coming back. But before we really deal with it in depth, we need to consider another formula, and this is the rate of surplus value, or actually, to be even more specific, it is the rate of the exploitation of the proletariat. So we have two formulas that will be considered herein, and those are the rate of profit formula and the rate of surplus value formula. And I just want to emphasize that C in the formula stands for constant capital. This would be buildings, machinery, raw material, or again, constant capital, C. V, or variable capital, essentially stands for the wages of the working class. And surplus value is in a sense what's produced, and this allows for capital accumulation, and allows for new machinery to be introduced, for new workers to be hired, and surplus value is where profit is derived from. So you need to keep that in mind. Those are what those initials stand for. Those are what they mean. Now, with the formula S over V, or the rate of surplus value, or the rate of the exploitation of the proletariat, this shows how newly created value, again, surplus value, is divided between workers and capitalists. Now, let's take this example. Let's say that the rate of exploitation is 100%. This means that newly created value is divided into two parts, or rather two equal parts, one going to the workers in their wages, and the other going to the capitalists in the form of profits, interest, etc., etc. Now, when the rate of exploitation of the proletariat is 100%, and we're assuming an 8-hour day here. The 8-hour day consists of 2 equal parts. 4 hours where the workers are producing the value of their labor, their wages, their means of subsistence, and 4 hours where they produce surplus value that is taken, expropriated without payment by the capitalists. This being understood on the rate of exploitation, let us move on to the rate of surplus value, the rate of exploitation of the working class. At first, it seems that if the fraction for the rate of profit, again, S over C plus V, or surplus value over constant and variable capital, increases, if it increases, and the organic composition of capital increases equally, then constant capital becomes increasingly greater relative to variable capital. Again, constant capital increases, constant capital, again, buildings, machinery, increases relative to wages, and the value of this fraction tends to diminish since S, surplus value, is a product of V, or variable capital, and not of constant capital. The growth in the organic composition of capital, which I did explain in another video, I want to very briefly recap here, is due to capital. They want to increase production. They want to produce more surplus value, more profit. But if they hire more workers, they may have to hire them at, say, higher wages. And they want to keep labor costs low. So you may want to use labor-saving machinery. So as opposed to, say, hiring 10 workers to produce 1 car on an assembly line that's going to take a while, you say have a better assembly line that can produce 10 cars but only use 1 worker. So you may expand that production to produce so many cars, and you may be hiring a lot of workers, but in a sense, less labor power, less workers are needed to put in operation, say, fewer machinery. And this means that, of course, you're increasing exponentially with constant capital, the means of production, buildings, machinery, raw material, as opposed to variable capital, wages, as it were. And the value of the fraction, therefore the rate of profit, is going to tend to diminish, since surplus value is not the product of constant capital, but rather it's a product of variable capital. Because if those machines, the constant capital, is lying idle, if no one's using it, it's not making any money. You need workers to be at work, as it were. You need workers to be laboring to produce, because that's the only way that value and ultimately profit is going to be created. And now there is a factor which can neutralize the effect of an increase in the organic composition of capital, or an increase, and this is an increase in the surplus value rate. For instance, you could have workers. Well, so let's look at this. If you have S over V, again, the rate of surplus value, or the rate of the exploitation of the proletariat, the surplus value rate increases. This means that in the fraction S over C plus V, both the numerator and the denominator increase, and in this case, the value of the fraction can remain the same under conditions where the two increase is to occur in a certain proportion. So in other words, the rate of exploitation went up from 100% to 166%, roughly. And this is because, say, it takes less time for the workers to produce their wages, and therefore they only really have to work for themselves, as it were, for 3 hours as opposed to 4. And therefore the rate of exploitation is going up. And this would tend to keep the profit rate from pretty much staying average. And another way to increase the rate of exploitation would in fact be to increase the number of hours the workers are working. We could see this if I change the number of hours from 8 to say 10 or 12. You can see that the rate of exploitation would also go up. So, and so in other words, an increase in the surplus value rate can neutralize the effects of an increase in the organic composition of capital. So remember, the value of capitalist production can be summed up by the following formula. So this being said, now let us look at a particular branch of capitalist industry with the following formula. Now these figures are rather simple, and if you want to, you can put in, say, and figure out the organic composition of capital. You can figure out the rate of profit, the rate of exploitation, using the formulas I have provided for you, again assuming an 8-hour day. Now let us take this formula that I have provided, and let's say increase it, and we'll see what we get from there. Alright, for example 2, you can see that the number for constant capital is increased from 100 to 200, all other figures remaining the same. Now for example 1 and example 2, let us figure out the organic composition of capital, and notice how it has changed. So that is the organic composition of capital for example 1. The organic composition of capital is 50%. Now let us take example 2 from the example I've provided, where the organic composition of capital is 200, but variable capital and surplus value are both 100. And we will see that the organic composition of capital has in fact changed. So we can see from the examples I provided, 1 and 2, that the organic composition of capital, in fact, from example 1 is 50%, but in example 2 is in fact 66.6%. So in other words, there is a change. In example 2, more constant capital, more machinery, more raw material is being used, but the workers and the surplus value produced in both examples are remaining the same. But let's say, now, with the two examples I have, let's look at how the rate of profit actually changes in them. Having done this, now let us figure out what the rate of profit is for example 2, and remembering that the constant capital is 200 here as opposed to 100 in example 1. As has been demonstrated from example 1 to example 2, with the growth of the organic composition of capital, in example 2, therefore more raw materials, more machinery has been put into motion by, say, the same number of workers, the rate of profit, in fact, when it was 50% in example 1, is only 33.3% in example 2. Now let us take example 2 and let's tweak it just a tad, shall we? And we're going to change the surplus value, the surplus value rate, as it were, from 100 to 150. And we will see, in fact, that the rate of surplus value, this is assuming that the rate of exploitation of the proletariat is increasing, means that, in fact, the rate of profit will remain at 50%. So you can see that the capitalist is having the workers, say, perhaps work more or longer to produce the same rate of profit. We can see, in fact, that the increase in the surplus value rate from 100 to 150 in example 2, that this increase in the surplus value rate neutralizes the effect in the organic composition of capital. So let us just briefly look at this in example 2 in the change of the rate of the exploitation of the proletariat. So in fact, can the two movements, can the growth of the organic composition of capital and the increase in the rate of surplus value occur in the necessary proportions for them to neutralize each other, for the rate of profit to remain the same at 50% as opposed to falling as it does before any modifications that were made? Well, here it's very dicey and pretty much no. But there are some modifications, so just listen very closely. These two movements of the organic composition of capital and the rate of surplus value can't develop proportionally over the long term. There is really no limit, as it were, to the increase in the organic composition of capital. Capital, they want to keep labor costs down. They want to get new labor-saving machinery in there so they can put fewer workers to work, producing more surplus value. But at the same time, this has the risk that the rate of profit is going to continue to decline, as you saw from the long examples provided. Well, for variable capital, for V, or wages, there is a theoretical limit of 0 where you have total automation, getting wages all the way down to 0. You have, say, the worker is working 8 hours and it's S equals 8 over 0. So in a sense, you have a huge rate of exploitation in that case. But S over V can also increase in an unlimited way with no can it increase with no limit at all? Well, no. In order to produce surplus value or profit, you need to have workers producing. This being the case, the fraction in which the worker produces own wage can't fall to zero. So if the worker, say, is working 8 hours, and the 8 hours are producing for the worker's subsistence. And say in the ninth hour, it ends up the worker produces that 1 hour of surplus value. Well, say the capitalist introduces new and better machinery for the worker. The worker can produce his means of subsistence in less time. So instead of, say, taking 8 hours for the worker to produce the means of their wage that they can use to buy the necessities of life, it only takes 7 hours. And even better machinery is introduced and it goes to 6, and even better and it goes to 5, and so on and so forth. But it can't go to 0. You can't produce the whole wage in 0 minutes and 0 seconds. Capital can never reach this point. It's just impossible. So all this being said, all these examples given, this means that the rate of profit tends to fall. But this isn't some absolute thing. It's not just happening without any counteracting forces. There are counteracting forces to the rate of profit tending to fall. For instance, you saw from the example I gave you the increasing exploitation of workers. That's one example of how to counteract the rate of profit tending to fall. We could lower wages, so we're even producing less. So workers, you just cut the minimum wage by half, you're going to have more profit. Everything else being equal. And another thing you could do is you can cheapen the instruments of constant capital. For instance, as opposed to, say, spending $1,000 for a great computer that helps you to produce value, you only have to spend $500. I mean, you're going to be able to counteract the rate of profit tending to fall, or the growth of low organic composition capital industries, as opposed to high ones, where it's easier to get in and you can make a nice profit there. Or perhaps you could import cheap labor. You could do that, as opposed to just paying the workers you already have less. Or you could have, again, cheap means of production. Or perhaps you could migrate your capital to areas of cheap labor or cheap natural resources. And that way you could raise the rate of profit by raising the rate of exploitation, and or you could lower the organic composition of capital, because in those areas perhaps it's going to cost less to produce the means of production, and perhaps since the wages are low, you may not going to have to pay as much out to labor, but you can still make your super profits if you're a capitalist. Yet these counter tendencies to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall all operate within strict limits and at strict times. The fall in the rate of profit is the dominant tendency. This is not to say that there haven't been periods in capitalist industry when the rate of profit rises. That's true, it happens, but especially during times of economic crisis, you can see that the rate of profit does indeed intend to fall. Now, the calculations of percentages of profit rates have a real value, but a relative one to the capitalists. I gave these examples, but let's flesh it out a little. What interests the capitalist is not just the total percentage he makes on his capital, but the total amount on which he makes. So to give this example, and I'm not going to bore you with even more figures, but say you have 2% on $100,000 of capital, and that's your rate of profit. Well, how much profit do you end up making? Well, you end up making, in fact, $2,000 on a rate of profit of $100,000. Now, that 2%, let's take it to $100 million. That's a good figure. $100 million, that's your capital, the whole production process. And you have 2% of profit on $100 million. How much do you make? $2 million. That's a nice figure if you think about it. Now, the capitalist, granted, the rate of profit of 2% is not that much, but the capitalist would probably want that $2 million in profit as opposed to letting the means of production lay idle and laying off his workers. It all depends on, of course, concrete situations, but in general, we can assume that the capitalist would probably want that $2 million. Even though the rate of profit remains the same of 2% in these two different industries, you can see that the amount of money coming in drastically differs. Now, in practice, we therefore see that there is no total halt in investment activity following a fall in the rate of profit and interest rates, but rather a slowing down proportional to the fall in the rate of profit in a branch of industry. On the other hand, when there is more rapid expansion and a rising tendency in branches of industry, or during certain periods, investment it tends to speed up. Expansion has no limits, or so it would seem, until the rate of profit starts to fall again. We can see that these changes in the rate of profit are very much intrinsically linked to the whole concept of economic crises under capitalism. In conclusion, the desire for profit is the driving force of capitalism. That's why people get into business, not to do good, not to help people, to make money. Whatever their subjective needs are, if you want to stay in business, you have to run your business like a business. In other words, you got to make money, you got to make profit. Now, if the profit rate falls, we can see that this weakens the incentive to accumulate. And as accumulation slows down, it can lead to economic crises. It can lead to stagnation. You can see this whether in the 19th century, in 1929, or in 2008. And each crisis wipes out inefficient capitalists, and it brings stronger and more efficient ones to the fore. Those who are producing below the average rate of profit are no doubt going to be wiped out when an economic crisis occurs. And each crisis also not just wipes out the inefficient capitalists, but it leads to an assault on labor, whether it's the lowering of wages or the increasing of the rate of exploitation. And this allows the system to recover and to expand yet even more. Each recovery leads to more concentration, more centralization of capital, and each recovery leads to generally lower long-term rates of growth and long-term rates of profit. You can see this in the so-called jobless recoveries that keep being touted. Supposedly we're in a recovery now, yet there's really no growth now, is there? And the contradictions continue to exist. They continue to worsen. They continue to become more acute as the system endures and lasts. And yet there is no final crisis. There is no moment of absolute total capitalist breakdown. Rather, the system endures. It lasts until the workers gain consciousness and organize themselves to put an end to the system of capitalist rule.